Since the very conception of Western art, human beings have been telling stories about the glory to be won on the battlefield. One of the first heroes of literature, Achilles, muses to himself before facing the Trojans. Mother tells me, the immortal goddess Thetis with her glistening feet, that two fates bear me on to the day of death. If I hold out here and lay siege to Troy, my journey home is gone, but my glory never dies. If I voyage back to the fatherland I love, my pride in my glory dies. Homer's poem had an enormous impact on the conquerors of antiquity. Plutarch tells us that Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad, edited by Aristotle, along with him during his conquests. Imagine the modern price tag on that thing. And the Roman Virgil wrote the Aeneid to display the Roman conception of warlike virtue, which was heavily influenced by the Iliad. Franz von Mach's 1982 painting of Achilles' triumph after he kills Hector in single combat perfectly encapsulates the glory Achilles gave his life to feel. He stands tall in his chariot, enemy helmet in hand, soldiers celebrating behind him, while the once powerful Hector is dragged across the dirt. 25 years after Mach's triumph of Achilles, another painting was created by Christopher Nevinson that makes glory the central theme, but it looks a little bit different. This is Nevinson's painting, titled Paths of Glory. The painting and Humphrey Cobb's novel, which was the source material for Kubrick's movie, derived from a line in Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. The line reads, "The paths of glory lead but to the grave." I'll leave a link to the entire poem in the description. It's a striking line and one that has inspired many brilliant artists, one of which being a young Stanley Kubrick. His 1957 film Paths of Glory, based on Humphrey Cobb's novel, is a masterpiece, the first of many in his long career, and it's one of his most sentimental movies. The sexual themes emphasized in Full Metal Jacket and Doctor Strangelove are largely absent, with focus instead being put on the tragic results of wartime ambition and facing the unjust realities of life. The former topic is where we'll start. Kubrick begins the movie by telling the audience how World War I was fought. The narrator tells us successful attacks were measured in hundreds of yards and paid for in lives by hundreds of thousands. The soldiers we're about to follow are not fighting for Berlin or Paris. They're fighting for relatively small chunks of land, in this particular story, the anthill, a name chosen to emphasize its insignificance. The anthill only becomes a major target when General Paul Moreau is not so subtly offered a promotion for its capture. Moreau at first acknowledges the impossibility of the mission, but then convinces himself that it's manageable if the soldiers are sufficiently courageous. The strategic conversations occur in beautiful, bright interiors meant to contrast the claustrophobic trenches. The path of glory is not meant for the soldiers, many of whom will be cut to pieces by machine guns and artillery within moments of the initial charge. It's the generals, Moreau primarily, that see a path to glory, a path paved with the bodies of fallen men. And if their quote unquote achievable pursuit fails, blame it on cowardice. Their ambition initiates the entire tragedy. To drive this point home, Kubrick makes sure that when the soldiers look at the anthill, it seems like a continent away. But the generals, on the other hand, use binoculars to observe their prize, and it appears close enough to reach out and grab. Now, the thesis for the first part of the film, which is aimed at the generals, is delivered through a Samuel Johnson quote which Colonel Dax mentions to Moreau. Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Johnson isn't saying that patriotism or national pride is bad, he's saying that bad men use it as a mask for their self-interest. Moreau is one of Johnson's scoundrels. He visits the trenches before the bullets begin to fly, and believes this makes him an Alexander-like figure who leads from the front. He even criticizes other generals who don't visit the trenches for being too disconnected from their men. This is pure projection, of course. He awkwardly walks around the trenches asking French soldiers if they're ready to kill some Germans, and tries to make them believe that the massacre they're about to be forced into is a chance for them to win glory for their nation. Anyone who isn't desperate to die in a mud pit is a disloyal coward who must be banished. Those who make constant accusations of disloyalty tend to be the most disloyal people, and Moreau is no exception. He's willing to blow up his own men because they don't charge the anthill, and decides to arbitrarily execute three others for his own miscalculation. When Dax points this out to his superior, he's told that the failure was not a question for officers. Kubrick doesn't run away from the counterpoint, which is, somebody has to make impossible decisions during war. An army can't function without a head, and sometimes those heads make errors, which Brolard concedes to Dax later in the movie. Kubrick uses Moreau to show what a wartime leader should not be. Someone who dehumanizes his men and watches battles from an ivory tower as those of a lower rank die for his personal ambition. Leaders should aim to be like Dax. a man who's first out of the trenches and can analyze risk and reward without including his own selfish desires as part of the reward. Sadly, armies and governments are more often run by men like Moreau. Unjust leaders bring forth injustice and use patriotism as cover for their ambition. That's what the first half of the movie establishes. The second half focuses on a different question. How should you behave when you're on the wrong end of injustice? And it's this theme that really stuck in my mind the first time I watched Paths of Glory. Three men are selected to pay for Moreau's idiocy: Arnaud, Paris, and Ferrol. Now, all three men are victims of misfortune, but there's another level to the injustice done to Paris. His CEO, Lieutenant Roget, sends him to the kangaroo court because Paris saw the lieutenant accidentally kill a soldier during a recon mission, and dead men tell no tales. Roget was drunk and cowardly the night of the incident. Paris was brave enough to search for Private Lejeune after he went missing. And as a reward, he's made a sacrificial lamb for the reputations of his superiors. It's hard to conceive a more horrendous situation to be in. And you have to admire how the courtroom scene is shot to represent the injustice of the trial. The officers, including Dax, give many close-ups and medium close-ups with only themselves in the frame. The men being court-martialed are mostly left isolated in the background, but when they're brought up for questioning, they're never alone in the frame. The court doesn't recognize their value as individuals. After the sham court, we get the famous last meal scene, which took 68 takes for Kubrick to be satisfied. A new duck had to be prepared for almost every take, and I've heard that Stanley remains a villain in the duck community to this very day. What I love about Paths of Glory is how it teases a conventional happy ending. Dax is the hero, Moreau is the villain, so of course Dax will save the unlucky men and ride off into the sunset. Ferrol is convinced that this will be the case early on, and when the artillery captain informs Dax about his treacherous orders, you begin to see that cheerful image in your mind. Kubrick himself very nearly went in this direction for commercial reasons. But that's not how life is, and once the three men acknowledge their fate, they all crumble apart in their own way. Ferrol sobs his eyes out to Father Dupree. Timothy Carey is brilliant, by the way. Arnaud harasses Dupree and ends up getting brain damage in the resulting skirmish. And Paris, with the help of a cockroach, descends into an existential crisis. All of the responses are understandable, and I think the movie asks the viewer to consider how they would respond in a similar situation. Now, the ideal to strive for is not Ferrol or Arnaud. And on the morning of the execution, it looks like Paris is going to go down in a similar fashion to Ferrol. But then the sergeant who's supposed to escort the condemned men changes his outlook.
This is the last decision you'll have a chance to make on Earth. You can pull yourself together, act like a man, or we'll have to drag you out of here. In the end, it'll all be the same. It's up to you.
Paris takes those words to heart, and his final moments are some of the most moving in film history. This shot in particular gets me every time because it shows the two paths we can take. It's sort of ironic that Ferrol would despair at the thought of leaving a life that condemned him to unjust execution, but that's the odd relationship almost everyone has with life. It can be unbearable at times, full of random suffering, but the thought of it ending is terrifying. Shakespeare, of course, describes that fear perfectly in To Be or Not to Be. Paris overcomes his fear. When Roget approaches him, the man who sent him to die, he doesn't even show a hint of anger or resentment. He denies the blindfold, accepts Roget's empty apology, and then accepts death. And after 5 minutes of build-up, the execution happens in the blink of an eye. Life goes on. The next shot is of the generals dining in luxurious peace, and Moreau praises how wonderfully the men died. Although Dax is not able to save his men, he does see a glimmer of hope at the end. A German woman is brought to the French to perform, Kubrick's future wife of 40 years, by the way, and at first they heckle her and make her even more terrified than she already is, which causes Dax to think, maybe these soldiers are just as inhumane as the generals. But when her song begins, every single man is brought back to life before the war, and Kubrick gives incredible close-ups to show the yearning and sadness in their eyes. The emotional shift shows Dax that the decent good men are still there. It's just that the war has hardened their hearts, as it would anybody. But they aren't hardened forever. They just need to be reminded of goodness, compassion, in a world where survival is not the only objective, which is what the girl's song does. Despite ever-present calls for world peace, war will never go away, not as long as humans are around. The pursuit of personal glory disguised as national interest has started and intensified many conflicts, and Kubrick shines a light on what that looks like in its most absurd form. 5 years later, he'll dive even deeper with Dr. Strangelove. But maybe the most important takeaway from Paths of Glory centers on how we react to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. There will always be a strong impulse to wave a fist at the sky and rage or weep over what's gone wrong. But that's not the ideal to aim for. Paris is the ideal. Stand tall and endure, and if you go down with self-respect. There are so many layers to Paths of Glory you could study every scene for a week. That's what makes Kubrick special and why his movies continue to have a major impact on people every single day. If you want to see more Kubrick analysis videos, I have a few others you might enjoy. And make sure to like and subscribe on your way out to watch more film content from me in the future. Thank you so much for stopping by, stay safe, and have a fantastic rest of your day. I will talk to you soon.